Before the cameras learned his name, and before millions argued whether he was a genius or a fraud, there was a restless kid growing up in the quiet sprawl of Westlake, Ohio, who had no idea that his life would one day become a living case study of how attention itself could be turned into power and money and controversy. Because Jake Joseph Paul was born on January 17, 1997, into a middle-class American household where ambition was encouraged, but fame was not promised. And from the earliest days, Jake showed a strange mix of charm, rebellion, competitiveness, and hunger that separated him from other kids his age. As he wrestled with his older brother Logan, not just physically, but psychologically, always trying to outdo him, always trying to be louder, faster, bolder, and more unforgettable. And long before YouTube checks and boxing purses, Jake was already learning an unspoken rule of modern America, that visibility could be more valuable than approval. And this lesson would quietly shape every decision he made for the rest of his life as he moved through school, sports, and early internet culture, absorbing the rhythms of attention without realizing he was training for a battlefield that did not yet fully exist. Because in the early 2000s, social media was still forming its identity, and kids like Jake were unknowingly preparing to become the first generation raised not just with the internet, but for it. And when Vine launched in 2013, a 6-second video app that rewarded shock humor, timing, and personality, Jake Paul found his natural environment almost instantly, as if the platform had been built to amplify the exact traits that teachers often criticized in him. Because on Vine, being loud was not a flaw, being impulsive was an advantage, and being unforgettable was everything. And within months, Jake's face became familiar to millions of American teenagers who shared his videos, not because they were polished, but because they were energetic, raw, and reckless, capturing a sense of youth that felt unfiltered and real, even when it was exaggerated. And by the time Vine collapsed, Jake had already mastered a crucial survival skill of the digital age, which was migrating attention from one platform to another without losing momentum. And he did this by moving to YouTube, where longer content allowed him to turn his daily life into a serialized spectacle, blurring the line between reality and performance in a way that fascinated audiences and disturbed critics. Because every prank, every argument, every luxury purchase was framed not just as entertainment, but as proof that he was winning a game most people didn't even know they were playing. And when Disney Channel cast him in Bizaardvark, it appeared on the surface like a traditional success story, where an internet star crossed into mainstream media. But behind the scenes, the cultural gap between corporate entertainment and Jake's chaotic brand quickly became obvious, because Disney was built on control, predictability, and safety, while Jake Paul thrived on unpredictability, provocation, and risk. And this clash would explode publicly when his off-screen antics, including wild parties, neighborhood complaints, and increasingly aggressive behavior made headlines, turning him into a national controversy, and eventually leading to his exit from the show, which many saw as a career-ending mistake, but which Jake quietly reframed as liberation, because he understood something fundamental about American attention culture, which was that outrage often travels faster than approval. And from that moment forward, Jake Paul stopped trying to be liked and focused entirely on being impossible to ignore. And this decision marked the true beginning of his transformation from influencer into a self-styled empire builder, as he formed Team 10, a collective of young creators living together in a Los Angeles mansion, where content creation was treated like a nonstop production line. And critics saw chaos, exploitation, and ego, while fans saw ambition, loyalty, and the fantasy of overnight success. And the Team 10 house became a symbol of both the promise and danger of the influencer economy, where teenagers chased fame with the intensity of gold miners. And Jake positioned himself as both leader and lightning rod, absorbing hatred while converting views into revenue. And while mainstream media framed him as a reckless YouTuber corrupting youth, Jake was studying analytics, demographics, and retention curves, learning how controversy translated into clicks, and clicks translated into leverage. And it was during this period that Jake Paul began to articulate a worldview that many found arrogant, but which accurately reflected the shifting American economy, where traditional gatekeepers were losing power, and individuals with audiences could bypass institutions entirely and sell directly to millions. And this belief would eventually push him towards his most shocking reinvention yet, because when Jake Paul announced that he was becoming a professional boxer, the reaction was almost universally dismissive, with journalists, athletes, and fans laughing at the idea that a YouTuber known for pranks and scandals could step into a sport with a brutal, unforgiving history. But Jake understood something deeper about boxing's relationship with spectacle, because boxing had always relied on characters, villains, heroes, and narratives as much as technique. And in that sense, Jake was not invading boxing, he was reminding it of something it had quietly forgotten. And his early fights against fellow influencers were marketed not as technical exhibitions, but as events, drawing millions of pay-per-view buys. And while purists scoffed,
the numbers told a different story, showing that Jake Paul had successfully imported internet attention into a traditional combat sport, forcing promoters, networks, and fighters to confront an uncomfortable truth, which was that cultural relevance was now as valuable as championships. And as Jake continued training, obsessively improving his fundamentals, hiring real coaches and sparring serious opponents, the joke slowly began to lose its punch, because while he was not elite, he was undeniably disciplined and physically committed in a way that contradicted the caricature painted by his critics. And each victory, whether against retired MMA fighters or controversial opponents, added another layer to his evolving identity, transforming from internet clown to polarizing athlete, entrepreneur, and disruptor. And as his bank account grew and his influence expanded, Jake Paul began speaking openly about fighter pay, unionization, and exploitation within combat sports, positioning himself as both beneficiary and critic of the system, which confused observers who struggled to reconcile his past behavior with his current rhetoric. But this contradiction was precisely what made Jake Paul a uniquely American figure, because his story was not about moral purity or traditional heroism, but about adaptation, ambition, and the ruthless logic of attention capitalism. And by the early 2000s, Jake Paul was no longer just a YouTuber or a boxer or a villain, but a symbol of a generational shift where fame could be engineered, controversy could be monetized, and identity itself could be rebranded repeatedly in real time before a global audience. And as America argued about whether he was good or bad, talented or fake, Jake continued moving forward, unbothered by consensus, because his entire career had been built on the understanding that in the modern world, the loudest argument often wins, and relevance is the only currency that never crashes.
As the noise around his boxing career intensified, Jake Paul leaned further into a mindset that treated criticism not as resistance, but as fuel. Because every doubt reaffirmed the same pattern he had seen since Vine, which was that disbelief always preceded breakout moments. And while analysts dissected his opponents and questioned matchmaking, Jake was assembling a parallel infrastructure behind the scenes, investing earnings into training facilities, management teams, promotional companies, and brand partnerships that allowed him to operate less like a fighter chasing belts and more like a media conglomerate, controlling distribution, narrative, and timing. And this distinction mattered because Jake Paul was never trying to win boxing the way traditional champions had. He was trying to bend boxing toward the rules of the internet, where storytelling, cadence, audience engagement, and algorithmic momentum mattered as much as footwork and jabs. And when he fought former MMA champions, the discourse became even more heated, because purists accused him of cherry-picking, while supporters pointed out that no other newcomer in the sport was generating comparable revenue or attention. And the truth lived somewhere in between, because Jake Paul was simultaneously exploiting gaps in the system and exposing structural weaknesses that had existed long before he arrived, including stagnant promotion, aging stars, and a widening disconnect between young audiences and legacy sports marketing. And as pay-per-view numbers rolled in, networks that once dismissed him began returning calls, because capitalism rarely argues with profit. And this marked a quiet turning point, where Jake Paul was no longer fighting for legitimacy, but negotiating power. And the more power he accumulated, the more he began to articulate his long-term vision, which extended far beyond his own fights, into reshaping fighter compensation models, creating athlete-owned promotions, and challenging entrenched promoters whose business models depended on control rather than collaboration. And to many observers, this sounded ironic, coming from someone whose early career was built on pranks and provocations. But history is filled with unlikely reformers who emerge from the very systems they later critique. And Jake Paul fit neatly into that lineage, because he understood exploitation intimately, having both benefited from and been burned by digital platforms, corporate contracts, and public backlash. And this understanding fueled his push to launch ventures like Most Valuable Promotions, which aimed to spotlight underpaid fighters, particularly women, whose talent had long outpaced their earnings. And while skeptics accused him of image rehabilitation, the tangible results, including record-setting purses and mainstream visibility, forced even critics to acknowledge that something meaningful was happening regardless of motive. And this duality continued to define Jake Paul's public persona, as he oscillated between provocateur and advocate, between villain and businessman, between spectacle and strategy. And every time the public attempted to freeze him into a single identity, he shifted again, because stasis was the one thing he refused to accept. And outside the ring, his personal life continued to attract scrutiny, with relationships, friendships, and conflicts playing out under relentless digital surveillance, reminding audiences that modern fame offers no private rehearsals, only live performances. And this pressure hardened Jake in ways that supporters interpreted as confidence and detractors read as arrogance. But beneath both interpretations was a survival instinct, sharpened by years of being underestimated, mocked, and analyzed in real time. And as he approached the later stages of his 20s, Jake Paul began framing his journey in generational terms, arguing that his rise represented not an anomaly, but a blueprint for how influence would be built in the future, where creators would no longer ask permission from institutions, but instead build audiences first and negotiate power second. And this philosophy resonated deeply with young Americans, who saw traditional pathways narrowing while digital ones expanded unpredictably. And Jake's willingness to publicly fail, pivot, and persist offered a model of resilience that felt more relatable than polished corporate success stories. And yet the question of legacy hovered constantly, because attention can be fleeting and relevance must be continuously defended. And Jake Paul knew that history would not be kind by default. It would demand evidence, impact, and endurance. And this awareness drove him to take bigger risks, fight tougher opponents, and speak more openly about his ambitions, even when doing so invited ridicule. Because at every stage of his life, the same truth had proven reliable, which was that playing safe rarely changes the narrative. And by the mid-2020s, Jake Paul stood at a strange intersection of American culture, where entertainment, sport, business, and controversy collided, making him impossible to categorize neatly and forcing commentators to confront their own assumptions about merit, authenticity, and success in a world where traditional markers of achievement were being rewritten in real time. And whether one viewed him as a disruptor, opportunist, or inevitable product of the internet age, his story had already become inseparable from the broader history of how fame evolved in the United States during the digital revolution. And as future chapters continued to unfold, one thing remained consistent, which was Jake Paul's refusal to exit the conversation quietly. Because from Ohio to Hollywood, from Vine loops to boxing rings, from viral clips to million-dollar contracts, his entire life had been a study in momentum. And as long as attention continued to move, Jake Paul intended to move faster. As momentum carried him deeper into mainstream consciousness, Jake Paul became increasingly aware that his existence itself had turned into a cultural argument, unfolding across podcasts, sports desks, comment sections, and dinner tables. Because he was no longer just an individual making choices, but a case study, forcing America to debate what counts as earned success in an era where algorithms could elevate someone faster than institutions ever could. And this tension followed him into every arena he entered, including politics, business, philanthropy, and even labor rights. Because Jake Paul's public statements began touching subjects that extended far beyond entertainment, such as healthcare access for fighters, long-term brain trauma, retirement security, and the imbalance of power between promoters and athletes, issues that traditional boxing champions had often whispered about privately, but rarely broadcast with the volume Jake commanded. And this was precisely what unsettled establishment figures, because his reach bypassed the filters that had historically controlled which voices were amplified and which were ignored. And while critics argued that his understanding was shallow, supporters countered that lived experience with exploitative systems often produces clarity that theory cannot. And this argument mirrored broader generational divides across America, where younger audiences increasingly distrusted legacy expertise and gravitated toward figures who spoke plainly, even imperfectly. And Jake Paul's willingness to be wrong publicly, then adjust, became a feature rather than a flaw, because it reflected the same iterative process that defined internet culture itself. And as his fights grew more competitive, his training camps became more disciplined, resembling those of traditional contenders, with nutritionists, psychologists, strength coaches, and data analysts all contributing to a regimen that contradicted early narratives portraying him as unserious. And with each camp, his body changed, his technique sharpened, and his confidence matured into something quieter, more calculated, less performative, which surprised observers who expected perpetual escalation rather than refinement. And this evolution extended to his business dealings as well, where early impulsiveness gave way to structured negotiation, long-term planning, and diversified investments across crypto, real estate, apparel, and media production, ensuring that his income streams did not rely solely on physical competition. And this foresight was shaped by watching countless internet stars rise and collapse, victims of platforms that giveth and taketh without warning. And Jake Paul was determined not to become a cautionary tale, because he understood that the same audience capable of elevating him could abandon him just as quickly if novelty faded and relevance waned. And so he leaned into reinvention again, positioning himself not merely as a fighter, but as an executive producer of events, crafting entire fight weeks into spectacles, complete with documentaries, press conferences, viral soundbites, and behind-the-scenes access, turning each bout into a multi-platform narrative that extended far beyond the final bell. And this approach reshaped expectations around combat sports promotion, demonstrating that fights were no longer isolated contests, but content ecosystems. And while purists lamented the loss of mystique, younger fans embraced the transparency because it aligned with how they consumed everything else, from music to politics. And this generational alignment helped Jake Paul maintain cultural gravity, even as public opinion fluctuated, because while love and hate oscillated, attention remained constant. And attention was the one variable he knew how to convert reliably.
And yet the deeper his influence grew, the more scrutiny followed, including legal disputes, public feuds, and constant attempts to predict his downfall, because American culture has always been fascinated by rises, but even more obsessed with collapses. And Jake Paul was acutely aware of this pattern, having witnessed it claim countless celebrities before him. And rather than denying this inevitability, he incorporated it into his narrative, framing himself as someone perpetually underestimated, perpetually targeted, perpetually climbing. And this resonated because it mirrored the experience of many young Americans, navigating unstable economies, volatile job markets, and institutions that no longer guaranteed security. And in that sense, Jake Paul became less a role model and more a mirror, reflecting both the opportunities and anxieties of a generation raised online and judged in public. And as he moved closer to matchups against more credible opponents, the stakes intensified, not just financially, but symbolically, because each fight now represented a referendum on whether unconventional pathways could produce legitimate excellence, or whether spectacle would eventually collapse under the weight of reality. And Jake embraced this pressure because he had built his entire identity around defying expectations and proving that legitimacy itself was often a construct enforced by those with the most to lose from change. And win or lose, he understood that participation alone had already altered the landscape, because boxing promoters, fighters, and networks were now forced to engage with creators, acknowledge digital audiences, and adapt promotional strategies that would have seemed absurd a decade ago. And this ripple effect extended beyond boxing, influencing how other sports leagues, entertainers, and brands approach influencer partnerships and athlete branding, demonstrating that the lines between creator, athlete, entrepreneur, and activist were dissolving rapidly. And Jake Paul stood at the center of this convergence, not as a polished visionary, but as a relentless experimenter whose life played out in public trials and errors. And as the years progressed, the question shifted from whether Jake Paul would be taken seriously to what seriousness even meant in a world where relevance, influence, and capital were increasingly decoupled from traditional validation. And by continuing to operate at this intersection, Jake Paul ensured that his story would not be confined to highlight reels or scandal montages, but studied as a defining example of how fame, power, and identity evolved in early 21st century America. And as long as that evolution continued, his narrative remained unfinished, always pushing forward, always daring the next boundary to resist him.
As time stretched forward and the immediacy of shock slowly gave way to the gravity of consequence, Jake Paul began confronting a quieter but more complex phase of his journey, where growth was no longer measured only by numbers on a screen or knockouts in a ring, but by the durability of the structures he was building around himself. Because history tends to be less interested in how loudly someone arrives, and more focused on how long they remain relevant once novelty fades. And Jake understood that permanence required more than controversy. It required systems, teams, and the ability to evolve without erasing the past. And this realization marked a subtle shift in how he spoke publicly, less reactive, more reflective, yet still unapologetically assertive. Because apology had never been his currency, accountability, however, was becoming unavoidable as his audience aged alongside him and began demanding substance alongside spectacle. And this generational maturation reshaped the tone of his content, his interviews, and even his rivalries, which became less cartoonish and more strategic, framed around ideology, economics, and the future of sport, rather than personal insults alone. And this transition was not seamless, because reinvention rarely is. And Jake faced moments where attempts at seriousness were mocked as performative, while returns to provocation were criticized as regression, trapping him in a perpetual double-bind familiar to many public figures who grow up under constant surveillance. And yet, instead of retreating, he leaned further into transparency, acknowledging contradictions rather than denying them, which paradoxically strengthened his credibility among those who valued authenticity over polish. And as his boxing career continued, Jake began to openly discuss the physical toll of the sport, including injuries, recovery cycles, and the psychological pressure of preparing for public combat, where failure is not private, but immortalized in clips, memes, and commentary. And this vulnerability did not weaken his brand, it complicated it, adding depth to a figure once dismissed as one-dimensional. And in parallel, his business ventures expanded into media production, sports management, and athlete advocacy, creating a feedback loop where his personal experiences informed institutional critiques and proposed reforms. And while skeptics questioned motives, the measurable outcomes, including increased pay, visibility, and opportunities for marginalized fighters, made dismissal increasingly difficult. And this pattern repeated across his endeavors, where initial cynicism gradually yielded to reluctant acknowledgement as results accumulated. And this gradual shift mirrored broader cultural changes in how Americans evaluated influence, moving away from rigid categories toward outcome-based judgment. And Jake Paul's career became a living example of this transition, forcing observers to confront uncomfortable questions about whether intent mattered more than impact,
and whether unconventional messengers could still deliver meaningful change. And as public discourse around creator economy regulation, labor rights, and digital monetization intensified, Jake found himself cited not just in entertainment news, but in academic discussions, industry panels, and policy debates, illustrating how far his influence had extended beyond its prank-filled origins. And this expansion into thought leadership territory was perhaps the most unexpected evolution of all, because it placed Jake Paul in rooms once reserved for executives, athletes, and lawmakers, blurring boundaries that had long separated entertainers from decision-makers. And while he remained controversial, his presence alone signaled that the pathways to power were diversifying and that cultural capital could now rival institutional pedigree. And this reality unsettled traditional hierarchies, but empowered a new generation who saw in Jake's trajectory a proof of concept that persistence, adaptability, and audience connection could unlock doors previously guarded by credentials and connections. And yet, even as his influence broadened, Jake Paul never fully escaped the shadow of his early persona, which continued to resurface in public memory whenever missteps occurred, reminding everyone, including himself, that reinvention does not erase history, it reframes it. And this tension between past and present became a defining feature of his narrative, illustrating the cost of growing up online, where mistakes are archived and growth is continuously compared against former versions of oneself. And navigating this landscape required resilience, a willingness to absorb criticism without becoming immobilized by it. And Jake demonstrated this resilience repeatedly by returning to work, refining strategy, and maintaining momentum even when public sentiment turned hostile. And as years passed, his story began to crystallize into something larger than individual success or failure, becoming instead a chronicle of how modern fame functions, how attention is converted into leverage, and how individuals can challenge entrenched systems, not by seeking approval, but by building alternatives. And whether future historians frame Jake Paul as a pioneer, disruptor, opportunist, or transitional figure, his impact on the intersection of digital culture, sports, and entrepreneurship had already secured his place in the broader narrative of American cultural evolution. And as the next chapters of his life continued to unfold, shaped by aging markets, shifting platforms, and emerging competitors, one truth remained evident, which was that Jake Paul had never been chasing a destination, but a process, one defined by constant motion, adaptation, and refusal to disappear quietly. And as long as the world continued debating his relevance, he remained exactly where he had always intended to be, at the center of the conversation, shaping it simply by refusing to exit it. As the conversation around him matured, Jake Paul entered a phase where legacy stopped being an abstract word thrown around by commentators and became a daily consideration shaping how he chose opponents, how he invested money, and how he positioned himself within American culture. Because he understood that history does not preserve noise alone. It preserves patterns, influence, and the ways individuals accelerate or redirect larger movements. And in that sense, Jake began viewing himself less as a solitary figure, but more as a node within a rapidly evolving ecosystem of creators, athletes, and entrepreneurs who were collectively redefining power structures that had remained largely unchanged for decades. And this awareness sharpened his strategic patience, because while earlier in his career, speed and shock had been primary weapons, now timing and alignment mattered more. As he watched platforms rise and fall, audience behavior shift, and regulatory scrutiny increase around influencer marketing, gambling sponsorships, and digital labor practices. And these shifts forced him to think several moves ahead, recognizing that survival in the next era would require credibility across multiple domains, rather than dominance in a single one. And this realization pushed him toward partnerships that emphasize longevity, including alliances with established sports organizations, philanthropic initiatives tied to athlete welfare, and educational content aimed at demystifying business mechanics for young creators who idolized his success without fully understanding its risks. And this mentorship role emerged organically, as aspiring influencers, fighters, and entrepreneurs sought his guidance not because he represented perfection, but because he represented possibility, having navigated chaos publicly and emerged intact and financially independent. And while critics dismissed these efforts as reputation management, the consistency of his involvement suggested a deeper commitment to shaping an ecosystem that would outlast his own relevance. And this long view extended to how he framed his own failures, openly dissecting losses, setbacks, and miscalculations as instructional moments rather than narrative endpoints, reinforcing a philosophy rooted in iteration rather than image. And this framing resonated strongly in an American landscape increasingly defined by nonlinear careers, gig economies, and constant reskilling, where traditional narratives of steady ascent no longer matched lived experience. And Jake Paul's willingness to model adaptation rather than certainty offered a counterpoint to outdated success myths. And as his boxing career progressed into more demanding territory, the margin for error narrowed, physically and symbolically, because each bout now carried implications not just for his record, but for the credibility of the entire crossover athlete phenomenon. And Jake embraced this weight, understanding that pressure validated significance, and that indifference was the true enemy. And as training intensified, his lifestyle adjusted accordingly, with stricter routines, quieter preparation, and fewer public distractions, signaling a maturity that contrasted sharply with his early years and surprised longtime observers who had built static images of him in their minds. And this maturation did not eliminate controversy, but it reframed it. Because when conflict arose, it now centered on structural issues, negotiations, fairness, and control, rather than impulsive spectacle. And this evolution reflected a broader trend among creators who aged into leadership roles, transforming from entertainers into stakeholders. And Jake Paul stood as one of the most visible examples of this transition, forcing media outlets to update their narratives in real time, often struggling to keep pace with his shifting priorities. And as public discourse caught up, analysts began situating his story within a longer American tradition of self-made disruptors who leveraged emerging technologies to bypass gatekeepers, from early radio personalities to cable television moguls to Silicon Valley founders. And while comparisons varied, the through line remained consistent, which was an ability to recognize when rules were changing and move decisively before institutions adapted. And this ability had defined Jake Paul's career from the moment he picked up a phone camera and realized that distribution was power. And as newer platforms emerged and younger creators studied his blueprint, some replicated his tactics while others refined them, learning from both his successes and his mistakes. And in this way, Jake's influence propagated indirectly, shaping strategies even among those who publicly distanced themselves from his persona. And this diffusion of impact marked the transition from celebrity to historical figure, because history often measures significance not by admiration, but by imitation. And as Jake Paul continued navigating an unpredictable future, shaped by technological acceleration, cultural polarization, and shifting economic realities, his story remained emblematic of a specific moment in American life, when attention became currency, identity became fluid, and individuals armed with audiences could challenge institutions once thought immovable. And whether celebrated, condemned, or endlessly debated, Jake Paul's journey persisted as a living document of that transformation, unfolding in real time, refusing resolution, because resolution would imply an ending, and endings had never been part of the equation. Only motion, only evolution, only the next iteration, waiting just beyond the present moment.
As the years layered upon one another, Jake Paul's presence settled into a paradoxical state of familiarity and unpredictability, where audiences felt they knew him, yet could never fully anticipate his next move. And this tension sustained relevance in a cultural environment saturated with fleeting personalities. Because while many internet figures burned brightly then vanished, Jake adapted by internalizing a lesson older than social media itself, which was that survival favors those who study the system as carefully as they study themselves. And this analytical instinct became more visible as he began referencing metrics, market cycles, and historical precedents in interviews, revealing a mind increasingly oriented towards synthesis rather than impulse. And this cognitive shift coincided with a broader reckoning across American media, where questions of authenticity, monetization, and responsibility collided, forcing creators to confront the consequences of scale. And Jake Paul stood at the center of that reckoning, both as contributor and subject, because his trajectory embodied the promises and pitfalls of the creator economy more vividly than any academic paper could. And as lawmakers, journalists, and economists debated regulation, audience protection, and platform accountability, Jake's career was repeatedly cited as evidence that traditional frameworks lagged behind cultural reality. And this external validation of his relevance reinforced his commitment to shaping rather than reacting to the future. And as he continued building ventures that extended beyond his own image, including production pipelines, talent incubators, and athlete representation models, he gradually decentered himself from the spotlight, redirecting attention towards systems that could operate independently of his personal fame. And this decentralization marked a sophisticated evolution, because it acknowledged a truth many celebrities resist, which is that personal relevance is finite, but institutional influence can persist if designed thoughtfully. And this shift did not mean disappearance, but redistribution of focus, allowing Jake to transition from protagonist to architect within his own narrative, while still retaining the ability to step forward when necessary. And as his boxing career inevitably approached moments of limitation, imposed by age, injury, and competition, he prepared for those transitions with the same strategic foresight that had defined his earlier pivots, ensuring that identity would not collapse when one chapter closed. And this contrasts sharply with the cautionary tales of athletes and influencers who struggled to adapt once primary revenue streams dried up.
And in that contrast, Jake's discipline became most apparent because it revealed that beneath the spectacle had always been a planner, someone attentive to cycles, aware of mortality, and determined to outlast trends rather than chase them endlessly. And as he spoke more frequently about mental health, burnout, and the psychological cost of constant performance, his narrative intersected with a growing national conversation about sustainability in digital labor, highlighting the invisible pressures faced by those whose livelihoods depend on perpetual visibility. And this advocacy added another layer to his evolving legacy, positioning him not only as a beneficiary of the attention economy, but also as a critic seeking guardrails for those who followed. And while cynicism remained inevitable, the consistency of his engagement suggested sincerity born from experience rather than strategy alone. And as time continued its quiet work of reframing perception, Jake Paul's early controversies began to recede into historical context, no longer dominating discourse, but informing it as reference points rather than defining traits. And this reframing illustrated how distance alters judgment, allowing society to view figures more holistically once immediacy fades. And as younger audiences encountered Jake's story not through scandal headlines, but through documentaries, retrospectives, and case studies, they absorbed a more nuanced narrative, one that emphasized adaptation, resilience, and structural impact over individual missteps. And this generational handoff underscored the fluidity of reputation, reminding observers that cultural memory is not static, but continually rewritten by new perspectives. And as Jake Paul remained active, evolving, and engaged, his story resisted closure because closure would imply a final verdict, and verdicts rarely capture lives shaped by constant reinvention. And in this open-endedness, his journey mirrored the era that produced it, an era defined not by linear progress, but by iteration, disruption, and perpetual negotiation between individual agency and systemic forces. And as long as those forces continued shifting, Jake Paul's narrative remained relevant, not as a finished tale, but as an ongoing study in how modern American ambition expresses itself through screens, stages, rings, and institutions, all at once, endlessly adapting, endlessly contested, and forever unfinished. As the arc of his story curved toward an ending that was not an exit but a settling, Jake Paul arrived at a moment where the urgency to prove himself gave way to the responsibility of contextualizing himself, understanding that history would not remember every win, every view, or every controversy, but would remember the shift he embodied, the proof that power in America had quietly migrated from institutions to individuals who understood attention, distribution, and ownership. And this realization brought a calm clarity that contrasted sharply with the chaos of his early rise, because he no longer needed to shout to be heard, having already altered the volume of the room itself. And as he looked back across the chapters of his life, from an Ohio childhood to internet infamy, from mocked outsider to unavoidable participant in serious economic and cultural conversations, the through line became undeniable, which was that Jake Paul had always been less interested in fitting into existing systems than in stress testing them until they either adapted or revealed their weaknesses. And this instinct had carried him through ridicule, failures, reinventions, and resistance, shaping him into a figure who could not be reduced to hero or villain, but instead represented a transition point in American history, when the meaning of merit, success, and legitimacy was renegotiated in real time before a global audience. And as future generations studied the early decades of the digital age, they would find his name not because he was perfect, but because he was early, because he moved before consensus formed, because he exposed fault lines others preferred to ignore, and because he demonstrated that influence, once gained, could be redirected towards structure rather than spectacle if one chose to grow with it. And in that sense, Jake Paul's story ended not with a final fight, a final upload, or a final headline, but with a quieter, more enduring outcome, which was the normalization of a new pathway where self-made visibility became leverage, leverage became ownership, and ownership became the foundation for lasting impact. And as the noise faded and the era advanced, his legacy remained embedded in the systems he helped reshape, leaving behind not a single conclusion, but an open blueprint etched into the evolving story of modern America, where attention is power, identity is fluid, and history is written not only by institutions, but by individuals bold enough to redefine the rules while the world was still arguing whether they were allowed to play at all.